Hello, beautiful people. I am back with your third lesson. I hope that you enjoyed the reading that I planned for you in lesson 2. We are going to cover a few things today, but before we jump into any of that, I just want to highlight my email address on the screen because if you have questions or concerns or things that you need to explain to me, you can always drop me an email. I am checking it regularly, and I will do my best to respond to you as quickly as possible. So if you don't have my email address, just look there. It's on the screen. You can email me, all right? All right, so let's get into what we're going to talk about today. Hopefully you are excited. So there are a few different things that we're going to cover today. First and foremost, we are going to identify some symbols in the story. Where are you going? Where have you been? And we're also going to work to articulate their significance. So we're going to talk about that subtext here. We are going to talk about some strategies for interpreting subtext. And a lot of that strategy will be me posing a question to you, helping you to kind of get your little hamsters on the wheel and think about what I might be hinting at so you can arrive at the answer versus me telling you the answer outright. I'm going to do my best to do that here today. But before we continue with the lesson, if you have not finished reading Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates, I highly recommend that you stop this video and you finish reading. Otherwise, you're going to have some challenges understanding, and we may actually spoil some things for you with this particular story. So I don't want that to happen. So if you haven't finished reading, that's okay. You can do this lesson at your own pace. Just finish reading. I think you'll be happy that you did. So moving on. So let's talk about subtext, i.e. reading between the lines. When you read literature, there's always a story that is kind of happening on the surface and one that's happening just beneath the surface. Sometimes authors intend to do this and other times they don't. It just kind of happens and it makes the story a little bit more interesting. The story that is happening just below the surface, so things that you have to kind of interpret, is called subtext, meaning you have to really read between the lines. It's not going to blatantly tell you this is the story that's going on beneath the surface. You kind of have to draw in information from what you're actually reading, make some assumptions based on the world that you live in, and draw some conclusions that way. So why do we have subtext? I think I mentioned this in a previous video, or at least started to touch on it in a previous video. So writers, they use this sometimes intentionally or unintentionally because it does provide an extra layer of interest for the reader. And it's a way to really subtly communicate some larger things about society that the author wants to share with us. The subtext of a story usually does provide some like broader meaning or bigger meaning that the author wants us to walk away with after reading his or her work. So that's why it exists. Will it always exist in every story? No. Will it always be obvious to every reader? No. Will the subtext that I pick up on be the same as what you pick up on? No. So this is what really makes the story interesting because you can have your own interpretation of it. And speaking of interpretation, that was a great transition. Did you see what I did there? Did you see? Okay. All right. Well, first, I want to make sure we understand the difference between interpret and what that means. So when you interpret something, it's a verb, right? You're trying to understand what something is or why it has particular significance. Interpretation is the action or of explaining something that you've actually done the interpreting for. What could possibly influence how we interpret things, how we see things? Well, a lot of different things. Our age. So depending on how old or young we are, we might have a different perspective about things. Our backgrounds, our education, our gender. I don't look at the same things the same way a man would look at them because I'm a woman. So certain things just feel different. look different, sound different. I interpret them differently just because of my own perspective and what I'm bringing to the table. Your personal experiences also play a huge part in how you interpret something. It's kind of like the way we say everyone has their own perspective. Everyone has their own interpretation of something based on their own personal experiences, along with all of those other things that I mentioned. Now, it's not exclusive to only those things. There are a variety of reasons why people could have different interpretations of a story, but I just want to highlight a few key ones that usually play the biggest role, right? So how the heck do I begin to interpret literature, Teacher Latoyia? It's a really tough question because it literally takes a lot of practice. And not because it's hard, but because you have to walk yourself through a thought process that you may not be familiar with. But in order to start this process, you first need to be a critical thinker and a critical reader. So what does that mean? It means that you read and you annotate a text, and you always question, why is this thing happening, or why is this important? Critical thinkers who are going to interpret literature also start to notice symbolism in a text. They notice the subtext, or, they're reading between the lines, always trying to figure out, is there anything more to what I'm actually reading here? And then they kind of use all of that information, they gather it all together, and they start to make conclusions and assumptions about what certain things mean or why certain things are happening in a story. So there are a few different elements to interpreting literature. It doesn't just happen overnight. You really do need to practice. And today we are going to practice that skill set together. And as I mentioned, I am going to really be challenging you guys to arrive at your own conclusions as much as possible, rather than just giving you the answer. So I will kind of lead us there. I'll guide us together with some information, but I will be asking you big questions that you'll need to answer on your own in order to begin to interpret this particular text. All right. Yet again, one more time. If you have not finished reading Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates, please stop the video. All right. When you go forward, you're not going to understand what we're talking about, and it may confuse you even more. So you can always come back, but I highly recommend that you finish reading the story first. All right. I promise it will be worth it. Okay. So we're going to continue, assuming that everyone has finished reading the story. So now that you finished reading the story, what if I told you that much of Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates has lots of religious subtext? What if I told you that? Would you believe me? And if you believe me, would that change your understanding of the story at all? Just think about that for a second. I would hope that it would change your perspective of the story, because maybe you'll start to notice some things that I'm going to point out in a bit. All right, so in the next few slides, I'm going to be highlighting some elements that I think we should focus on, and some elements that are actual symbols in the story. And I am going to be providing you some information and details on the screen, and then asking you some questions that you'll need to think about on your own to begin to interpret. Before we move any further, I do want to make a public announcement. I am not an expert on religion, nor am I trying to advocate for any one religion here. I'm simply taking what I found in the story, using what I know about the world to present information to you. All right. So this is not like a rally for everyone to be into religion or anything like that. It's simply using what I know about the world and communicating that to you. So the first item that I want us to focus on from the story, these specific words, they talk about music, they talk about church, they talk about things being sacred or like really holy and religious. And they talk about these havens, which that word sort of reminds me of heaven, but I'm just going to put a little pinpoint in that and let that marinate for you guys there. something that you should notice is that Oates, that's Joyce Carol Oates, she's constantly comparing things that are really fun that kids love to do with things that you would not necessarily associate with church. So, for example, Oates compares the non-religious music that Connie is listening to when she's out with her friends to being in a church service, which is obviously very religious. The music is very holy and like godlike, and those two things don't seem to kind of mesh well together. So it's an odd comparison. But because she does that, it does set the stage of what is going to happen later on in the story, which is that there is going to be this religious undertone throughout the text. So it's important that we pay attention to that. And also, just a note that I found when I was doing my research about this is that the Bible does hint that Lucifer was the angel of music prior to his fall from heaven, which I think is a pretty interesting thing that somehow the author was able to weave in there. Is it going to be important? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. We definitely should just keep it in the back of our heads because it might become important later in the story. So I want you guys to really think about what the text says in regard to Connie and her relationship with religion. It is definitely in there. There's a few sentences that talks about how she feels about religion. So you can go back to that on your own time, but I just want to highlight that it is there because it may provide us with, again, some insight as to what some of the subtext in this story is. All right, so one symbol that I do want to highlight. So this is our first symbol, Connie's hair, this physical thing, her hair, right? It's supposed to represent something else here in the story. And I think it's supposed to represent something else because of the way that the author describes it. So Oates writes, and I'm going to read verbatim here from the slide. Quote, Connie had long, dark blonde hair that drew anyone's attention to it. And she wore part of it pulled up on her head and puffed out, and the rest of it she let fall down her back. So we know it's golden blonde. We know that there's a saying out there, or at least I'm going to tell you that there is a saying out there that a woman's hair is her crown, right? She wears it proudly. I think it's really interesting here how Connie wears her hair. So let's read between the lines together. Connie's hair may be this sort of halo in a sense. Let's think about it. She wears it up and puffed out. I'm thinking like a really big bun, you know, and then she lets the rest fall down her shoulders. So that bun could maybe represent a halo. And if that is the case, then her hair maybe represents the idea that she is the innocence in this story or something that's good in this story. So again, as a reader, I'm reading what the text literally says. I'm taking the information. I'm asking, why is that important? What could this possibly mean? And I'm drawing some conclusions and making some assumptions about how this fits into this religious undertone of the story. And this is what critical readers and critical thinkers do when they're trying to interpret a story. Another symbol, the doorway. And I don't know if you guys have ever stood in a doorway before, but I thought this was the most compelling piece of evidence to symbolize what the story might be about. We're going to talk about that now. In the story, it has both characters, or all three characters, Connie, Arnold friend, and the other guy, I think Ellie, standing in the doorway. So Connie's in her house, Ellie and Arnold friend are outside. She's kind of like, I'm kind of in, I'm kind of not in. I don't know if I want to leave or I don't know if I want to stay. Behind her, if Connie's in the doorway, is the safety of her home, right? She can always go in, close the door. That's the end of Arnold friend. You'll never see him again, or he'll just stand outside until her parents get home. But in front of Connie is Arnold friend and Ellie, who could be potentially dangerous. So she's kind of standing there trying to decide if she really wants to go out and kind of greet him and actually talk to him, or if she would prefer to stay inside. Um, if we read between the lines here, the two sides of the doorway could present Connie with a decision that she should make. One side could represent something that's good and safe, her home, and the other side could represent something that's bad or dangerous, and that's Arnold Friend and Ellie, who are standing on the outside. So she's really forced to kind of make a decision here, which is, should she stay or should she go? And that kind of decision making kind of makes me think of those like animated cartoons when you have the little angel and the little devil on your shoulder, right? They're kind of talking like, you should do this. No, no, that would be a bad idea. You should do this. So those two things for me popped into my head, and hopefully that starts to translate to you when you think about how long she spends in this doorway talking to this stranger and trying to make a decision about what should happen. Okay, so this next symbol, they're actually numbers, something that we should probably focus on. And again, I want to emphasize that I am not an expert on religion. I'm not an expert on the Bible. I've had to do research about this. So if you find that some of my information is incorrect or not quite on the mark, you can always email me and let me know. I'll correct it, or you can put it in the comments of this video. So the two numbers I want to highlight are 19 and 17. As I mentioned before, Oates, the author, is hinting at a lot of religious things in this particular story. And the number that Oates uses in the text could refer to Judges 19:17. I believe that is a book and verse in the Bible where it says, quote, "When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, 'Where are you going and where did you come from?'" Ooh, that's kind of spooky, right? Like, wow, how did this author get that in there? Like, she weaved in some things from the Bible that really speak to, one, the name of this story, and kind of gives it a little bit of a creepy factor because of what's taking place. Or the numbers could refer to Genesis 19:17, which says, quote, "As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, 'Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains. Flee to the mountains will be swept away.'" So this could potentially be a warning to Connie to flee, to close the door. Don't talk to Arnold Friend. Don't talk to Ellie. They're both dangerous. But we're not quite sure. So again, this is an interpretation. I'm taking the text as I read it. I'm asking why, doing a little bit more digging, and I'm making connections in my real world experiences and the information that I'm bringing to draw some conclusions about what's happening here. You with me so far? I hope so. I hope so. All right, let's keep going. All right, another symbol that I want to highlight is this idea of pairs or two-ness. Some would call this duality. So that's a fancy word for saying two. Duality. Oates writes specifically that Connie does have two sides. If you remember at the beginning of the story, she says that Connie acts one way at home, but then she acts differently when she's out with her friends. And I think that can be said for all of us. We probably don't act the same way we do all the time in every situation. But let's go back to the idea that she wears her hair part up and part down. There's another two-ness factor. Arnold Friend and Ellie make a pair, right? They came to Connie in a pair. They're two different people. And the doorway itself separates the setting of this story into two different places. We have inside Connie's home and outside Connie's home. So let's read between the lines here. And now I'm going to try to get you to draw some of your own conclusions about what this two-ness might represent, given what I've just covered on this slide and the fact that we're talking about religion. So, reading between the lines, what might Oates be trying to communicate to us about what this story may be about? I'm not going to give you the answer here. I just want you to think. We're talking about two-ness, duality, religion here. There's a lot of religious undertone. There may be something that Oates is trying to lead us to in our own thinking. Keep that in mind. All right, let's keep going. There are a few more symbols here. The most bizarre symbol that I found in this story, a wig, the mask, and makeup. And collectively, all of these things make me think of a disguise, or like when you go on stage, you turn into a different person. And then I wondered, as a critical thinker, why would anyone need a disguise in this kind of situation? So let's again read between the lines. We have this religious undertone to the story. We have this concept of duality. Interesting, two-ness, right? And now we have a character, specifically Arnold Friend, who is wearing all three of these things, or appears to be wearing all three of these things. So as critical readers and critical thinkers who are trying to interpret this subtext, we have to ask ourselves, what purpose would Arnold Friend have for wearing a disguise? Why would he do that? And if he is wearing a disguise, who could he be? Who might he be? I don't know. I mean, I do have an idea, but the goal here is to get you to think about who he might be and why he might be wearing this disguise. All right, so let's talk about Arnold Friend as a symbol for something. So yes, he is a tangible thing in the story. He's a person in the story. Or is he? I don't know. Okay, that was a big hint. I'm going to be quiet now. All right, so let's look at the phrases and the text that is used to describe this particular character. I think it's very unusual and not at all common that this character, Arnold Friend, is described with tar-like eyelashes. Usually you would just say they have dark eyelashes or black eyelashes, but in the story, it specifically says tar-like eyelashes. And when I think of tar, I think of something that's really hot, because where else does tar come from? They talk about this character's nose being very long and hawk-like, kind of pointy, which makes me think dangerous a little bit. If I saw someone with like a hawk nose, it was very pointy or sharp, I'll be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. They talk about how he wobbles in his boots, which is odd because usually people don't wobble unless they are unstable. So it makes me think, as a critical reader, what might be happening in his shoes for him to feel kind of like off center, because he is standing on the ground. So he's not like balancing on anything. Connie talks about how he sounds very persuasive. He's saying all the right things for the most part. He's trying to be really sweet and nice and complimentary to Connie, try to woo her, get her to come outside. And at some point in time, Connie does say that it almost appears that his appearance changes. So we're not certain for sure as readers if it does, but in the text, there is a moment where Connie does say that his appearance seems to have changed or shifted a little bit. So let's read between the lines, shall we? Knowing what we know about religion, Christianity specifically, what can we assume about Arnold Friend, and who does he remind you of? What things in the story does Oates present that helps us to make those connections about who he might be? Again, I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm trying to get you to draw out those conclusions for yourself, because it will help you to practice interpreting this story and interpreting the symbols in the story. All right, let's keep going. A few more. So the symbol of the X that Arnold Friend draws in the air, I think that's really interesting. My first thought as a critical thinker and a critical reader is, well, what would I use an X for? And as an educator, usually if I'm marking a paper and something is incorrect, I draw an X on it because it's wrong or incorrect. If I use a map, like let's say it's back in the olden days when people had paper maps, or I was a pirate, I would put an X over where my treasure is or where an important spot on the map is. Um, but then I started to think, well, there's also when you watch cartoons, and if a cartoon is supposed to be playing dead, they usually put the X's over their eyes, right, to symbolize they're no longer with us, even though it's a cartoon, um, which I thought was interesting. So then it got me thinking, if you put an X on someone's picture, what might you be implying about what will happen to that person? And I ask that because in the story, it says that Arnold Friend draws an X in the air in front of Connie. And for her, it almost seems that she could see that X visibly there. So if he draws that X in the air in front of her, what might it signify about what will happen to Connie or what could happen to Connie? I think you can kind of draw some conclusions. I'm hoping that you can keep at it, keep practicing if you can't, but I think it will become clear. So there is some work that I'd like you to do. We have come to the end of the lesson in terms of symbols, and there's some independent practice work and some backstory information that I'd like you to read about this particular piece of fiction. So this story may have been inspired by a real event, which just kind of ups the creep factor for me. I know that you guys asked for something a little bit creepy, a little bit out there. So hopefully now that we've gone through what some of those symbols mean, and know that it may have been based on a true story, that gives you that little weird tingle in the back of your spine. They're like, that's totally creepy. I want you guys to read this article called Man Called the Pied Piper of Tussin Kills Three, Buries Them in the Desert. It's a news article. The link is on the screen. I don't expect you to be able to copy that down, so I'm going to try to link it to this video so you can simply click on it and read it. It does provide some details that may be a little disturbing, a little bit creepy, but I think that is important that you all read and see if you can draw any connections to what actually happened to the story. Where are you going? Where have you been? So that's reading number one. Reading number two, I'd like you to read Murder in the Desert. It's going to be a PDF. I'm going to figure out whether I can link it in the video or have one of your awesome coordinators send it to you via email in a PDF format. In any case, you can always Google it too. Just as a warning, this reading, Murder in the Desert, is a bit more graphic than the first reading. So if you find that you are sensitive to that kind of thing, I would recommend that you just read the first one and not the second. This way I can be mindful of that, and I totally respect that if you are uncomfortable reading things that are a little bit gory. I'm not a fan of horror. I did read both articles. I thought they were really interesting. I did not read them at night, but if you are okay with that, you are certainly welcome to read those whenever you so choose. I hope that the lessons that I've provided have been interesting. They have been helpful in getting you to understand how to interpret text. And at the very least, they have given you something exciting to do while you are working from home. And as a final note, I just want to make sure that you guys know that we are definitely thinking about you. I know we're not able to be together in person, but I do want to make your learning experience as interesting and as helpful as possible. So if you do have questions, do not be afraid to email me with those. I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. And in the meantime, in between time, I hope that you all remain safe, that you and your families are safe, and that you are finding time to enjoy each other's company. If I am not able to see you all for the summer, please enjoy your summer months, and hopefully we'll see each other in the fall. Hopefully. All right, everyone, stay safe and have a beautiful day, beautiful people.